Chapter 723. Ning Shuima was indeed saved by the ancestor. He saved her in Yifeng. Then what about Yi Qingyuan? She was the ancestor's only female disciple. Did he politely ask Yi Qingyuan for her? Or did he directly snatch her away? Ning Shuima had no recollection of this. Ning Shuima narrowed her eyes. She didn't expect that she had unintentionally given Yi Qingyuan a chance to meet the ancestor. She didn't know what kind of shocking scene it would be when the master and disciple met. It was a pity that she was unconscious and didn't see that scene. Ning Shuima's fingers slowly clenched in her sleeves. The enmity between her and Yi Qingyuan was set. That woman had caused her to be so miserable. She had never suffered such a big loss in her life. This debt must be repaid with her own hands. She must also let her taste the feeling of being unable to live and unable to die. But she didn't know if the ancestor would intervene at that time. Would he be biased towards his only female disciple? Ning Shuima shook her head. She didn't care anymore. She would think about this later. No matter what, she must take revenge. She wouldn't give anyone face. At most, she would find that woman and have a fair duel, regardless of life or death. That way, the ancestor wouldn't say anything else. The most important thing for her now was to become stronger. She must become stronger. As the saying goes, 10 years is not too late for a gentleman to take revenge. She hoped that Yi Qingyuan could live a little longer, and not die too early. Master. Another person led a group of disciples over and bowed respectfully to Yelu Jing, and Ning Shuima glanced at the group of disciples. Her heart moved. The clothes they were wearing were obviously not from the Sun Moon sect. Moreover, they had all kinds of uniforms. Most of them were around 13 or 14 years old. There was a hint of childishness between their eyebrows, but each of them was full of spirit and energy. Moreover, there was a hint of curiosity and excitement in their expressions. Could it be that these were new disciples? No. Even if new disciples entered the Sun Moon sect, they would wear the same uniform. Could it be that they just wanted to recruit him? Ning Shuima's guess wasn't wrong. The youth leading the group was Yelu Jing An's disciple. After he finished bowing with the group of half-grown children, he immediately reported, "Shifu, there are a total of 60 people selected this time. After 10 more days of training, we'll be able to see their true aptitude. Then we can ask Shifu to choose." Yelu Jing An nodded slightly and let his disciple lead that group of people down. Ning Shuima had vaguely heard that the Sun Moon sect was recruiting new disciples a few days ago. It was not long after she had transmigrated here. At that time she was busy running for her life, so she did not pay attention to this news at all. He didn't expect to run into it today. Her heart moved and she looked at Yelu Jing and, "Yelu?" Facing this youth's face, she really couldn't say the word senior. Thus he asked vaguely, "May I know the criteria for your sect to accept disciples this time?" Yelu Jing An smiled faintly. Earth grade level 1 aptitude, single attribute, clever and intelligent can enter. He swept his gaze over those who had just passed by. These were selected from the 800 disciples who applied. The lowest aptitude is Earth grade level 1, but their attributes are not bad, so they were selected. However, these people will go through 3 more rounds of elimination. In the end, only 18 people will remain and formally become disciples. They were indeed geniuses among geniuses, the cream of the crop. No wonder the Sun Moon sect could become more and more powerful. All the cream of the crop came here. Who is accepting disciples this time? Ning Shuima was curious. Chapter 724. Ning Shuima had a rough understanding of the people in the Sun Moon sect. Yelu Jing An answered all her questions. "Us brothers will accept all of them." "Oh right, this time the ancestor will also accept one. And it's not limited to males or females." When he finished speaking, he gave Ning Shuima a meaningful look. Ning Shuima's eyes flashed with surprise. Didn't the ancestor only accept one disciple every 80 years? It seemed that his last disciple was Ji Yunhuang's master, and it was only 50 years. Why did he make an exception now? And it's not limited to males or females. If he really accepted a female disciple, then Yi Qingyuan wouldn't be his only female disciple. This would be an extremely heavy blow to that woman. Ning Shuima's lips curved slightly. The depression in her heart seemed to lessen a little. When she read the master-disciple novel and saw that her master wanted to accept another female disciple, She felt distressed for the female lead. But for Yi Qingwan she only felt good. Yelu Jing and glanced at her and suddenly said, "Miss Ning, do you want to be apprenticed? Maybe you can give it a try." Ning Xuema was stunned for a moment, but her heart was moved again. Being apprenticed to the ancestor was indeed the fastest way to improve one's skills. But with her status, it would be awkward to be apprenticed to him. He definitely wouldn't accept her. Ning Xuema shook her head and smiled. "My psychokinesis is now human rank 5. I'm afraid it's not up to your standards, so I don't want it." Yelu Jing and glanced at her again and smiled. "Miss Ning doesn't need to belittle yourself. The Sun Moon sect doesn't only look at psychokinesis, they also look at other talents. Especially the ancestors' disciples, they don't stick to one pattern. If Miss Ning is interested, you can give it a try. What if you're chosen?" Ning Xuema pondered for a moment. "I'll think about it." She felt that there was something fishy about this, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Yelu Jing and smiled warmly and didn't say anything else. She led her back to Heavenly Sound Peak. "Miss Ning must be tired after a day. Go back and rest early." Ning Xuema paused. She was still traumatized by the water wall enchantment on the Tianyin Peak. Moreover, if she were to stay here to learn, shouldn't she be staying with the new disciples? He even wanted her to go to the Tianyin Peak? "Elder Yelu, I think it would be more appropriate to give me another residence. Heavenly Sound Peak is where the ancestor lives alone. I heard that only his direct disciples can go there. I'm afraid it's not appropriate for me to go there." Yelu Jing and's footsteps didn't stop. "Lady Ning is overthinking. You are different from others. The ancestor has specially ordered you to stay on the Heavenly Sound Peak for the time being, until your name is confirmed." While they were speaking, they had already arrived at the foot of the Tianyin Peak. The waterfall was still splashing around like a tidal wave. Yelu Jing and raised her hand and took out a bamboo umbrella. She handed it to Ning Xuema. "The water enchantment here has been removed. Miss Ning can use the umbrella to enter and exit from here." Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. Was the water enchantment removed for her? Wasn't the ancestor afraid that other people would enter the place where he lived alone? She took the umbrella and jumped towards the waterfall with Yelu Jing, and the water enchantment really disappeared. The waterfall was just like the legendary waterfall in front of the water curtain cave. After she jumped in, she directly entered a cave. Following the bluestone steps of the cave, she walked up hundreds of steps. Her eyes lit up as she finally saw the familiar scenery. Yelu Jing and led Ning Xuema to the side hall where she first woke up. Chapter 725. Yelu Jing and stopped and said, "Miss Ning, you should rest here. If you need anything, you can directly send me a message." He then handed Ning Xuema a light green sound transmitting talisman and taught her how to use it. The method was a bit complicated, but Ning Xuema was very smart. She learned such a complicated method after seeing it once and quickly became proficient in it. Yelu Jing and looked at her with surprise, as if he didn't expect her to learn so quickly. Looking at her, his eyes flashed with a touch of deep thought, but he didn't say anything. He was about to say goodbye when Ning Xuema suddenly said, "Do the ancestors' disciples all live in this hall for a while?" The hall she was referring to was the one they were going to live in now, and it was also the only side hall on this peak. Yi Qingwan had also cloned a smaller one. Yi Qingwan was so fond of this side hall that she didn't hesitate to clone one for her. Presumably, she had lived in this hall and left a good impression, so even if she was expelled from the sect, she was still reluctant to leave this place. Yelu Jing and shook his head. "No, even if we become the ancestors' disciples, we will still live at the bottom of the peak. When the ancestor teaches martial arts, we will come up." He glanced at the side hall. "Miss is the first to live in this place." Yelu Jing and turned around and left, leaving such a bomb for Ning Xuema to digest for a moment. She shook her head, not willing to think too deeply, and walked into the side hall. She was really tired and needed a good sleep. As for the ancestor, Xuema hadn't seen him since she came up, so she didn't know if he was in the main hall. Since she was living in his territory, it was reasonable to go and greet him. Ning Xuema was a person of action, so she immediately went to the main hall to look for him. There weren't many buildings on Heavenly Sound Peak. After an hour, Ning Xuema had already searched the entire Heavenly Sound Peak, but she didn't see the ancestor's figure. Since she couldn't find him, Ning Shuama gave up on searching and returned to the side hall to rest. Ning Shuama had a habit of checking the place she slept in before she could feel at ease. It was like an obsessive-compulsive disorder that could not be changed. Therefore, she was no exception here. She secretly checked the inside and outside of the hall, and only felt relieved after confirming that there was nothing out of the ordinary. She actually found a book on a wooden shelf in the hall. The book was thread-bound, and on the cover of the book were a few large, flamboyant words. Jade Firmament Wisdom Technique. The handwriting went straight through the back of the paper. It was extremely beautiful. Every word seemed to be able to fly out of the paper. Although Ning Shuama had never seen this handwriting before, she felt it vaguely familiar. No one else had lived in this place before, so it shouldn't have been left behind by the previous occupant. Then, did this book belong to the ancestor? A person like him shouldn't have the habit of casually throwing books, right? So this book was obviously placed here for her to read? Ning Shuama didn't stand on ceremony. She flipped through a few pages and her heart pounded wildly. What was written on the book was the cultivation method of the wood and fire dual element technique. Moreover, the explanation was simple and easy to understand. After reading a few pages, Ning Shuama felt as if she was suddenly enlightened. After she came to this world because of her identity, she had been on the run and didn't join any sect. Therefore, the cultivation books she got were all unofficial versions. Not only was the writing obscure and difficult to understand, but there were also many contradictions. Chapter 726. To put it simply, the cultivation books that Ning Shuama got were like those sold on the streets, those martial arts manuals that cost a few yuan each. They looked mysterious but didn't have much practical value. But now, this book was extremely orthodox and very suitable for Ning Shuama's physique to cultivate. It was as if it was specially written for her. It made her feel like she had found a treasure. She wanted to become strong so much. She had been struggling to find a way. But this book had opened a golden door for her on the path of cultivation. It made her see hope. What made her even more surprised was that although this book looked thin, it was like opening a treasure bowl after opening it. It was inexhaustible, and there was no end to flipping through it. Ning Shuama didn't delay, and immediately started cultivating according to what was written in the book. 5 days she tempered without sleep or food for 5 days. In these 5 days she was 100 times more diligent than the sprinting before the college entrance exam. Every day she was cultivating. When she was really tired to the extreme, she fell asleep on the bed and rested for 2 to 4 hours before climbing up to continue cultivating. Out of the 24 hours in a day, she would spend 20 hours in cultivation. Even when she occasionally dreamed, she would dream about the contents of that book. In these 5 days, Dizun didn't come to see her, but that Yelu Jing'an came many times. In the beginning, every time he came it was to deliver food to Ning Shuama. Every meal was different, and the color, smell, and taste were all excellent. But Ning Shuama was now wholeheartedly focused on cultivating. Even when the food was placed on her table, she often forgot to eat. When Yelu Jing'an started delivering food to her, he was afraid to disturb her, so he only put the food on the table, thinking that she would naturally eat after she finished cultivating. Later he found that it didn't work. The food he delivered was left cold on the table, untouched. Yelu Jing'an had long seen through her cultivation. It hadn't reached the level where she couldn't eat. She always forgot that eating was bad for her body. So for the next few days after he sent her in, he would stand in the same spot and wait for her to finish her cultivation before immediately calling her to eat. He would only leave when he saw her walk to the table and start eating. What he didn't expect was that although Ning Shuama ate, she would often eat 3 to 5 mouthfuls before she hurriedly went back to practicing martial arts. She still didn't touch much of the food. She was too eager to become stronger. This kind of training was simply like going crazy. It was as if he didn't want his life anymore. Her skills had indeed improved a lot, but she had also lost a lot of weight. Fortunately, the ancestor had left her with an extremely orthodox cultivation method, which had the effect of nourishing blood and qi. Otherwise, with her current cultivation method, she was afraid that she would have suffered from qi deviation. At first, Yelu Jing'an would come 3 times a day. Each time she would leave after delivering food. Later on, he came 8 times a day. Not only did he bring her food, but he also watched her eat and secretly watched her practice, in case she did not practice properly and went crazy. He came more and more frequently and stayed longer and longer. In the end, he almost always came with documents. Ning Shuama was cultivating in the hall, while he was reading documents under a tree outside the hall. In order to let her calm down and eat, he also had to find opportunities to talk with her. He would intentionally or unintentionally ask her if there was anything she didn't understand. Right now, Ning Shuama's mind was filled with matters related to cultivation. Even if the secret manual was easy to understand, in the process of cultivation she would still have all kinds of questions. Naturally, she would ask Yelu Jing and for guidance. In the process of asking for guidance, she was pleasantly surprised to find that Yelu Jing, and also cultivated would attribute techniques and knew a lot more. Chapter 727. Yelu Jing, and was also a qualified master. His explanations were simple and easy to understand, which often made Ning Shuama feel enlightened. His work was dependable, his temperament was gentle, and he was neither impatient nor impatient. Moreover, he was very meticulous. Sometimes, when Ning Shuama encountered a difficult problem, before she could even open her mouth to ask, he would already explain it to her according to her symptoms. This allowed her to avoid taking unnecessary detours. This Yelu Jing, and was simply a hard-to-come-by good master. What was even harder to come by was that he cultivated the same type of technique as her. Ning Shuama benefited a lot, but once she couldn't help but ask, "Elder Yelu, what are the conditions for accepting a disciple? Do you accept a female disciple?" Yelu Jing paused for a moment, smiled and changed the topic. If he were to accept a disciple, naturally it would be someone like Ning Shuama. Although her innate talent wasn't the highest, she was smart, hard-working, and could understand everything with just a hint. Others could draw inferences, but she could draw inferences. Every time he exchanged techniques with Shuama, he would be shocked by her sharp mind. This kind of disciple was something everyone would fight over. But even if he liked her, he didn't dare to accept her, otherwise his master would slap him to death. Sometimes Yelu Jing, and felt that Ning Shuama was too tired, so he suggested that she go out for a stroll. In order to attract her, he even talked about some wonderful scenery on Buddha Lotus Mountain. But Ning Shuama's desire to become strong was too strong, so she didn't want to waste a second. Other than occasionally chatting with Yelu Jing, and during meals, she didn't have the slightest intention of going out. It was a feeling that even 9 oxen couldn't pull her out. This made Yelu Jing frown. He was really afraid that if this continued, Ning Shuama would directly collapse from exhaustion. Her desire to quickly become strong had already become a kind of obsession. In these 5 days, the ancestor didn't appear once. Although this was his territory, there was no trace of him. Ning Shuama would occasionally be puzzled, but she also knew that the ancestor always appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Even his most trusted disciple might not know his whereabouts, so Ning Shuama didn't care about his sudden disappearance. Adding on to the fact that she was fully focused on cultivating, she even forgot to greet him. In the 1,000-year ice cave on the 1,000-year chilled jade bed, the ancestor sat quietly with his eyes closed. He wore a set of extremely simple white robes. His hands were placed on his knees, and a faint white light was slowly revolving around them. The white jade mask on his face had also been removed, revealing his celestial features. He sat there motionless like an ice sculpture. He didn't know how long he had been like this. His body trembled slightly, and his face paled as he opened his eyes. He couldn't calm his heart. He actually couldn't calm his heart. For thousands of years, his heart was as calm as still water. Every time he entered a meditative state, he would instantly enter the highest realm of cultivation, forgetting himself and others. When he went into seclusion, he could stay in seclusion for half a year, and he would not move or wake up for half a year. But not this time. Ever since Ning Shuama ran away from the marriage and he began to search for her, he had encountered all kinds of unexpected situations. In order to find her, he had no choice but to use a few forbidden techniques and expend a lot of his psyche. In order to remove the disguise technique for her, he once again resisted his exhaustion and used the technique for her. In the process, because he overestimated his ability to control her, he injured himself when he withdrew his palm. After removing the disguise technique for Shuama, he was also exhausted to the extreme. He almost didn't even have the strength to carry her back to her room. In order to heal her pair of legs, he flipped through medical books for an entire night. Early the next morning, he went to the demon realm to get some strange herbs. Chapter 728. Although the process was difficult, fortunately it was more daunting than dangerous. On the surface, the ancestor seemed to have left in a fit of anger, as if he no longer cared about her. But in his heart, she was constantly on his mind, fearing that she would cause more trouble. He didn't have time to rest and rushed back. When he came back, he found that her soul was missing. In order to find her soul, he used a lot of psychokinesis. It was not easy for him to find her. Once again, he used his overused psychokinesis to straighten out her soul. After this series of incidents, he was almost at the end of his rope. According to Rongyue Tianlan, he had to cultivate in seclusion for 15 days to recover. But he was always worried about Ning Shuama. He always felt guilty and wanted to see her. It was the first time he felt this kind of longing for a person, caring about a person, worrying about personal gains and losses. It was the first time he experienced it. His heart always seemed to be undulating. This situation made it difficult for the ancestor to cultivate in seclusion. He also didn't want to cultivate in seclusion because of his own ability. It wasn't until Shuama played with Yifeng Shui in the celestial lake that she slowly overcame her fear of water, that he waited for her in the bamboo forest for an entire day, that he finally couldn't hold on any longer. When he spat out a mouthful of blood, he knew that he had to go into seclusion. If he didn't cultivate in seclusion, it would be a permanent injury. It would be very difficult to recover. He could only choose to cultivate in seclusion. But after all, he was worried about Ning Shuama, so he sent his most capable disciple, Yelu Jing'an, to stay by her side. Yelu Jing'an was a very careful person. He was very reliable. He always did things according to the ancestors' orders. It was reasonable to say that he should be relieved after making such a careful arrangement. But for some reason he still couldn't calm down. He meditated for at least 2 days and 2 nights without talking or moving. But this time, he couldn't sit for a day before he opened his eyes uneasily. The first thing he did when he opened his eyes was to contact Yelu Jing and ask about Ning Shuama's situation. Although he didn't see Ning Shuama in these 5 days, he knew her situation like the back of his hand. The more he understood, the harder it was for him to calm down. It was true that the girl wanted to become stronger, but he didn't expect her to work so hard. This mental cultivation method of his was particular about progressing step by step, steadily and surely, avoiding impatience. If she continued to work hard like this, he was afraid that she would cultivate an inner demon. He had told Yelu Jing to explain the situation to Ning Shuama, but it didn't seem to have much effect. Because he was thinking about this, he became even more restless while cultivating. This time, he didn't even spend half a day in seclusion before he woke up again. Yelu Jing'an didn't know that the ancestor was actually in seclusion and thought that he was traveling outside. So every time she reported to him, she was very detailed and clear. This was exactly what he wanted. After waking up this time, the first thing he did was contact Yelu Jing, and this time Yelu Jing was a bit hesitant when she received it. Her first sentence was, "Master, she's showing signs of qi deviation. Disciple has just helped her recuperate. There are no other accidents. She's still practicing now." The ancestor's fingers tightened. "Let her rest." Yelu Jing'an's voice was a bit awkward. "Master, she looks like she listens to disciple's words, but after disciple leaves, she'll practice as soon as she wakes up. It wasn't suitable for a man like him to guard here at night." The ancestor frowned. This was a sign that she had entered an inner demon. He simply ordered, "Hit her sleeping acupoint." Although this method was simple and crude, it was effective on her. Chapter 729. A moment later, Yelu Jing'an's voice came from the sound-transmitting talisman, "Master, she is already sleeping. She can sleep for about 10 hours and will wake up tomorrow morning." Yelu Jing'an actually had a headache. This time it was solved, but what should he do in the future? After she wakes up, he was afraid that she would still cultivate day and night. How could he hit her sleep acupuncture point again and again? He looked at Ning Shuama's sleeping face and was somewhat lost in thought. What exactly did this girl go through to have such a strong obsession with martial arts? He had never seen a girl who cultivated so crazily. When the obsession was too strong, it would become a heart demon, and this heart demon must be treated with care and medicine. He turned around and walked out, sitting in front of the stone table outside the hall for the entire night. Although he didn't know the relationship between the ancestor and this girl, he knew that she was someone the ancestor cared about greatly. He definitely couldn't let anything happen to her in his hands. Perhaps he could only spend the night with her. Ning Xuema didn't sleep well that night. She had countless strange and messy dreams. In her dreams there were horses and spears, blood flowed like a river, and many people and things appeared. But when she woke up, she couldn't remember the scenes in her dreams. She slept for 8 hours. According to the modern calculation, it was 8 hours. After being forced to rest for a while, her spirit recovered a lot. Just as she was about to cultivate again, she suddenly heard a melodious flute sound. The flute sound was very peaceful, like a flower slowly blooming in the spring breeze. It had the power to calm people's hearts, calming Ning Xuema's restless heart from cultivating. To Ning Xuema, this flute sound was like a lullaby she heard in her dreams. It was familiar and intimate. She didn't know why, but when she heard this flute sound like spring flowers and autumn moons, her eyes inexplicably turned sour. She had the urge to cry. She took a deep breath and naturally understood who was playing this flute sound. The ancestor. He had disappeared for 5 days and now he had finally returned. Then she should go see him. After all, he had saved her life, bestowed her the book, and took her in. She jumped off the bed and was about to run out the door. Occasionally, she lowered her head and saw her wrinkled clothes. She was startled. How did he become so sloppy? These few days she was a bit obsessed with cultivating. Her meals were all eaten under Yelu Jing, Anne's coercion. As for washing up, she seemed to have only washed up 2 days ago. What have I become? Fortunately, there was a dressing mirror in the room. She looked at herself in the mirror and her body swayed. Was the crazy woman in the mirror her? Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, her face was pale, and there was a suspicious drool stain on her cheeks. Her originally clear eyes were bloodshot. Ning Xuema almost face-bombed. She was someone who loved to look pretty. Even though she wasn't a clean freak, she still liked to dress herself up beautifully. She couldn't bear to see others being sloppy. She never thought that there would be a day when she would act like a crazy woman. Not to mention the ancestor. Even she herself couldn't accept such an image. She wanted to die whenever she thought about how she was going to talk to that handsome elder Yelu Jing, and about spells in this form. No wonder when she faintly had the intention to become his disciple, that handsome guy would change the topic. Even she herself disliked her dirty appearance. She opened the door and came out. At this time Yelu Jing and had already left. The courtyard was quiet and there was no one around. Chapter 730. Ning Xuema fetched some water for herself and prepared to take a bath and clean herself up. Although she was always quick with her work, she was too sloppy this time. She had to wash twice to completely clean the dirt on her body. By the time she was done, it was already half an hour later. The sound of the flute was long and didn't stop. Ning Xuema looked into the mirror and found that she looked pretty good. Although her eyes were still a little red, it was good that she looked presentable. She then ran out. She listened in the courtyard and found that the sound of the flute was still coming from the vicinity of the White Tower. It seemed that the ancestor liked to play the flute there to attract phoenixes. She hoped that she wouldn't disturb his mood if she ran over. Ning Xuema's guess was correct. The ancestor was indeed near the White Tower. He sat lazily on top of it, his black hair scattered around his body like a curtain. He wore a white robe with dark silver patterns, and the white jade mask on his face shone slightly under the sunlight. White tower, white robe, green jade flute. Against the sea of clouds behind him. This scene was as beautiful as the inked mountains and rivers written by an immortal. It was almost impossible to move one's eyes away from it. He lowered his eyes and played the flute. This time he attracted even more beasts and birds. Not only were there on the bamboo shoots and on the mountain peaks, but even in the sky above his head, there were a few colorful birds with long tails, spreading their wings and dancing to the flute. Ning Xuema stood at the edge of the cliff and looked at him without saying anything. First, she couldn't disturb him. Second, his flute was indeed as warm as the spring breeze. It could calm all restless emotions. The cold wind was howling here, but listening to his flute made her feel like bathing in the spring breeze. She almost wanted to sit down and meditate. The flute finally stopped. The ancestor looked at her without any emotion in his eyes. The first thing he said was, "How's your cultivation?" Ning Xuema also remembered her mission. She cupped her hands and saluted him. Many thanks to the ancestor for the book. Xuema benefited a lot. When she first came, she was at the 5th level of the human realm. In just 5 days, she had broken through 2 levels and was now at the 7th level of the human realm. This kind of leveling speed was almost legendary, but it was still not enough. Among the newly qualified disciples, the lowest was Earth Stage Level 1. She would need to break through 3 levels in order to catch up to the lowest level. This kind of gap was simply despairing. Fortunately, Ning Xuema had the spirit of never giving up. In her dictionary, there was no such thing as being inferior to others. If she went back, she would continue to cultivate. She might be able to reach Earth Stage Level 1 in 5 days. Haste makes waste. The ancestor's gaze fell on her. Haven't you heard of this sentence? Ning Xuema paused. Of course she had heard of this saying before, but her sense of urgency was so strong that she almost couldn't control herself. Thank you, Dizun, for your advice. Xuema will remember and pay attention to it. Ning Xuema also knew that Dizun was doing this for her own good, so she sincerely thanked him. Dizun tightened his grip on the jade flute. Did she not know how to say anything other than thanking him? Come here. Dizun looked at her and said again. Ning Xuema raised her head and looked at the White Tower. It was about 7 floors high and occupied the entire opposite mountain peak. It was surrounded by empty air and was connected by only a small finger-thick iron chain. The mountain wind here was not small, blowing the thin chain like a swing. Under the White Tower, the sea of clouds was steaming. It was impossible to see what was under the sea of clouds, but it was most likely a cliff. Chapter 731. If Ning Xuema wanted to jump to the top of the tower, she would have to run to the center of the thin chain and then use the force to fly up. The White Tower was straight up and down, looking like it was directly frozen out of white ice. At first glance, it was obvious that it would be slippery. Once she stepped on air, she would directly fall down. Since she came to this world, she didn't know how many times she had jumped off cliffs. There was already a shadow in her heart, and when she saw a cliff, she would instinctively resist. Moreover, the top of the tower was so small that it felt like it was on the verge of collapse. If she went up, she might not even be able to find a place to stand. Dizun, if you have something to say, just say it. Xuema won't go over. Ning Xuema declined. Don't you want to become stronger? The Dizun bowed his head and asked. Of course. Ning Xuema answered without hesitation this time. She wanted to become stronger too much. Then come over. Okay. Ning Xuema raised her eyes to look at the Dizun on the top of the tower. His white robe fluttered as he stood there, like a god who was aloof from the world. This kind of person shouldn't be willing to see her in real danger, right? Then she would give it a try. She took a light breath and with a leap she landed on the thin chain. The tip of her foot touched the chain, wanting to take advantage of the momentum to jump up. Unexpectedly, just as the tip of her foot touched the chain, it suddenly sank down. Ning Xuema didn't feel like she was stepping on the chain. Instead, she felt like she was stepping into a swamp. It was as if 2 small hands had reached out from the swamp and were desperately clasping her feet. Not only did she not jump up, her body suddenly swayed, and in a split second the sky and earth spun around her, and she fell straight down. Fuck, this thin chain wasn't the way to the other side, it was a trap. Ning Xuema was shocked. She hurriedly exerted strength on her feet, flipped her body upside down, and grabbed the thin chain with both hands. Her fingers clearly touched the thin iron chain, but she didn't expect that the iron chain would turn into an illusion in an instant. She grabbed it as if she was grabbing a handful of fine powder. She watched as the thin iron chain shattered like dust, and she grabbed nothing. What's false is real, what's true is false. What's true in the heart is true, what's false in the heart is false. Qi flows to the Dantian. The venerable sovereign at the top of the tower quickly spat out a string of words. Ning Xuema was originally falling, but when she heard his words, she faintly felt a sense of familiarity. She didn't have time to think and immediately adjusted her breathing in the air. Her eyes flashed, and she finally saw that there was another transparent thin chain that was about the thickness of a strand of hair beside the thin chain. She chanted the wood incantation in her heart. Suddenly, a thin green vine flew out from her palm and wrapped around the transparent chain. This was real. Ning Xuema immediately sensed it. She flipped her wrist and used the force of the pull to flip up and land on top of the White Tower. Everything else was fake, but the White Tower couldn't be fake, right? As long as she used the force twice in the middle, she would be able to fly to the top of the tower. The tip of her foot landed on the wall of the White Tower, and then sank inwards. Her foot seemed to have kicked into the void bastard. This White Tower was also fake. She helplessly watched the towering White Tower shatter under her feet and scatter in all directions like meteors. Even the venerable sovereign at the top of the tower directly disappeared. Why was it all fake? Wasn't it a little bit real? Ning Xuema almost wanted to curse during the process of falling. The wind whistled in her ears. Her body passed through the clouds below and then, plop! She fell into a warm embrace. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head and saw an enlarged white jade mask in front of her. Chapter 732. The pair of eyes behind the white jade mask were as dark as the abyss. At this moment, they were slightly curved into a beautiful arc. Xuema fell into his arms under his wide robe. His arm was around her waist, and he spun in the air and rushed straight up. Ning Xuema's eyes blurred, and she had already landed on the glazed roof of the White Jade Tower. The top of the tower was narrow, less than 2 feet wide. She and the Dizun stood side by side on the top, so their bodies were inevitably pressed against each other. The Dizun's arm was around her waist, and his flowing hair gently fluttered over her neck, making her feel itchy. His white jade mask was different from the one Xuema saw last time. Last time, only his black eyes were exposed, and the rest of his face was covered. But this time not only could she see his eyes, but she could also see his perfectly curved lips. His lips were almost close to Xuema's ear, and his warm breath made her whole ear burn. Her body stiffened for a moment. His approach made her subconsciously feel dangerous, and she couldn't help but whisper, "Let go of me." Her voice was a bit stiff. The Dizun's eyes slightly deepened, and he readily agreed, "Okay." His arm loosened and he really let go of her. As soon as he let go, Ning Xuema suddenly felt her feet slip. The glazed roof that she had stepped on turned into an illusion in the blink of an eye. She stepped on empty air, and her heart was shocked, and she subconsciously hugged him. So she hugged the Dizun's waist again. The Dizun looked down at her. "This time I didn't let go of you." Strangely, the moment her arms hugged his waist, the glazed roof under her feet turned solid again. Ning Xuema was speechless. Her pretty face was faintly red, and she regretted listening to him. If she didn't have the idea of jumping up, she wouldn't be in such a dilemma. She turned her head to look at the path she came from, and began to think about jumping back. But after looking at the path, Xuema subconsciously tightened her arms around his waist. Clouds and mist rose from all sides like waves, surging in wave after wave. The White Tower she and the ancestor were in was like a lone tower standing in the middle of a sea of clouds, with no land in sight. She couldn't find the mountain peak she had come from, let alone know where was the safest place to jump. "Are you scared?" The ancestor's voice seemed to contain a smile. There was a hint of teasing in his voice. Ning Xuema secretly gritted her teeth. "I'm not afraid," she replied stiffly. "If you're not afraid, then why are you hugging me so tightly? You seem to be hurting my waist." The ancestor looked down at her. The little girl was curled up on him like a koala. 2 warm and soft arms hugged his waist, hugging him so tightly. The ancestor felt that this feeling was very good, and he gently twirled the jade flute in his hand. Although Rong Yue Tianlan wasn't very reliable at times, his method of picking up girls was quite reliable. The first way to pick up a girl: find a similar hobby. If the zither and the zither are compatible, you will definitely be able to hook the beauty's heart. This method didn't seem to work. He used the flute to summon Xuema, but she was still so guarded against him. The second method of picking up girls was to take risks together. It would be best if they fell off a cliff together, so he could hug her justifiably. Generally, a beauty's heart would soften after a few hugs. The ancestor felt that this method was a bit difficult to do. With his kung fu, falling off a cliff wouldn't hurt him at all. Moreover, if they really fell off the cliff, the little girl had many ways to save herself, and he didn't need to save her at all. Chapter 733. Even if Shuama needed his help when she fell off the cliff, it would only take him a moment to save her. He had never heard of anyone who couldn't reach the bottom after falling off a cliff for a few minutes. The time was too short. Even if he hugged a beauty, he wouldn't feel anything. He couldn't fall off an ordinary cliff, but he couldn't risk falling off the cliff below the White Tower. The ancestor pondered for an hour before dawn and finally thought of the White Tower that only he could climb. He had successfully fooled the little girl, and now she was hugging him enthusiastically. The ancestor felt that he had made a profit this time. It was the first time he had been hugged like this. He looked at the little girl in his arms and felt a little strange. It turned out that this was the feeling of being hugged by the person you liked. His heart was warm, and he subconsciously wanted to hug her back. However, Ning Shuama was clenching her teeth in her heart. What does this great deity mean? Was it really appropriate for him to tease her with his identity as the ancestor? Wasn't he afraid of exposing his identity in front of her? Shuama hugged his thin waist. Her nose was filled with his light fragrance, which made her feel a little dizzy and her heart beat faster. At the same time, there was an inexplicable repulsion. Shuama wanted to let go, but her survival instinct made her not dare to. If a drowning person caught a piece of driftwood, even if they knew it was a trap, they wouldn't let go easily. His teasing words made Shuama blush. She loosened her arms slightly and tried to calm herself down. Ancestor, please send me back to where I came from. I don't think this tower is a place I should come up. If you want to go back to where you came from, you need to work hard yourself, the ancestor said, his voice still flat. Work hard herself? How could she work hard? Now there was a vast expanse of clouds and mist, but the scenery was almost the same. Even the 8 sides of the White Tower were exactly the same. She couldn't tell which direction she was going. Asking the ancestor to point me in the right direction. Ning Shuama tried her best to use words to distance the two of them. Her tone was incomparably polite. The ancestor looked down at her. She kept her head down, so he couldn't see the expression on Shuama's face. However, her unfamiliarity with him made him feel uncomfortable. He said faintly, usually when I'm guiding someone, that person is kneeling. Ning Shuama was speechless. Actually, it was not that she did not want to kneel down, but she could not let go of him now. Once she knelt down, she would be hugging his legs. Hugging his waist, she still felt a little pressured. If she hugged his leg, she felt that she was still a little shy. Just as she was in a dilemma, her waist suddenly tightened. The ancestor had finally hugged her. In the blink of an eye, the ancestor had already sat down with her in his arms. I've been a little tired recently, so I'll take a rest. Ning Shuama was carried in his arms in a princess carry position, half sitting on his lap. The ancestor's arm was wrapped around her waist, allowing her to lean on his chest. This posture was really not an ordinary intimate one. Moreover, once he sat down, there was no place for her to stand. Ning Shuama raised her face to look at his white jade mask. Her body was a little stiff. She didn't understand the meaning behind his series of actions. Or perhaps she understood it in her heart, but subconsciously avoided it. Moreover, once he sat down, even if she wanted to go all out and kneel down, she couldn't find a place to do so. Ancestor. Ning Shuama didn't know what he was selling in his gourd. She could only sit stiffly in his arms and cope with the changes by sticking to the status quo. Chapter 734. The ancestor closed his eyes slightly and said lightly, I'm going to rest for a while. Don't disturb me. Ning Shuama was speechless. Is he going to meditate here? But he could just sit there and meditate. Why did he have to make her sit in his arms? In this case, Ning Shuama couldn't jump out of his arms with a chaste face. She simply sat on his body and looked around. When she came up, the White Tower was not far from the road she came from. She remembered that it was only a few dozen feet away, so she should be able to see it at a glance. The reason why she couldn't see it now was probably because it was covered by some array or some kind of spell. What method should she use to make the mountain appear again? She looked around again and again, trying to find a flaw in it. But it was strange. When she looked at the White Tower from the opposite mountain, she only saw white clouds around the White Tower. The sea of clouds undulated like thin waves, which was the same as the sea of clouds she saw on other mountains. But at this moment, sitting on the top of the white tower with the ancestor, she found that the white clouds were constantly changing, and their shapes were all kinds of strange. Sometimes it was like a battlefield where two armies were facing each other. All kinds of people appeared on the battlefield, fighting back and forth, and all kinds of arrays emerged endlessly. Sometimes it was like a martial arts competition between several masters. The people formed by the white clouds made all kinds of movements, and each scene was like a slow-motion movie. Every move and every style could be seen clearly. Moreover, every single one of those moves was something Ning Xuema had never seen or heard of before. At first, she was a little absent-minded, but after watching a few scenes in succession, she slowly sat up and looked at the movements of those white clouds. She couldn't help but start to remember those martial arts. The more she watched, the more addicted she became. In the end, she was so engrossed that she forgot where she was and that she was sitting in the ancestor's arms. Addicted to watching, she couldn't help but stretch out her hand subconsciously. The ancestor opened his eyes and looked at her, who was completely fascinated in his arms. She had lost a lot of weight, and there were many red streaks in her eyes. This showed how hard she had been working recently. His palm seemed to have accidentally pressed on her back. Soon, he measured her current level of psychokinesis according to the flow of psychokinesis in her body. She was at the 7.5 level of the human realm. In the past, he wouldn't even bother to look at this level of telekinesis. But it was a miracle for this little girl. To be able to cultivate to such a level in just a few short months, it was truly a legend that no ordinary person would have ever imagined. Perhaps she was the weakest in the Sun-Moon sect, but in other sects, she was a fine jade that others couldn't even dream of snatching. He had seen how difficult her journey had been. Now that Xuema could be like this, he was very gratified. She was not ordinary. She had too many miracles that made people's eyes light up. Like a shining magnet, it attracted the attention of countless people. Of course, it also attracted his attention. She had created so many miracles, so it should be related to her soul. In fact, Dizun had noticed from the very beginning that she and her body were not the same person. It was as if she had reincarnated in another body. He had a slight suspicion that her original body was from the devil world, but after seeing Xuema's illusion in the stone spirit's stomach, he knew that she was indeed a human, a real human. However, the soul came from a different world that even he didn't know about. The heaven and earth spirit chi here was much more abundant than in other places. It was much better for him to cultivate here than in other places. His plan was to meditate with Xuema in his arms. With her wisdom, she should be able to see some of the formations formed by the white clouds. Naturally, she would be able to cultivate. Everything was developing according to his expectations. The only thing he didn't expect was himself. With the beauty in his arms, he was no longer worried about Xuema. But he still couldn't calm down and meditate. Some of her unconscious movements were fatal to him, and he couldn't help but have a reaction. Originally, when he saw her, he wanted to protect her under his wings and watch her grow up healthily. When he saw that she didn't walk the right path, he would feel angry. That feeling was like looking at a bright pearl that was covered with a layer of dirt. Ning Xuema squatted beside him and gently patted his arm. The ancestor's eyes were still closed, and he didn't move. Ning Xuema didn't give up. She called him several times, but he still didn't move. Even his eyelashes didn't move. Wasn't he completely dizzy? He was pretending. He must be pretending. She didn't believe that such a godlike person could faint from falling. If this spread out, no one would believe it. She also didn't believe it. Maybe this was another one of his methods. Ning Xuema stood up. Ancestor, are you just lying down here to rest? Or do you want to borrow some earth energy? Chapter 738. Okay. Then Xuema won't disturb you for the time being. I'll go ahead and check the road first. Ning Xuema said as she walked. She had already seen that she had fallen into a forest. The other forests were basically a mix of trees with all kinds of tree species, tall and short. Strangely, there was only one tree here. The trunk of this kind of big tree was iron gray in color. Because all the leaves had fallen, the branches were like thick and thin iron bars, malevolent like the claws of a demon, reaching into the air. There were cracks on the trunk of the main tree. Upon closer inspection, those cracks looked like the facial features of an ugly person. At first glance, it looked like a ghost's face was grinning at people. Although Ningxuama was bold, she was still shocked by the ghost's face on the tree. She clenched her fingers. Looking up, there were undulating clouds above her head. She had clearly fallen from the mountain peak, but she couldn't see any shadow of the mountain in this dense forest. It was as if she had fallen from a high place out of thin air. It was obviously the beginning of winter. The leaves on the big trees had all fallen, and the cold wind was blowing. Logically speaking, the forest should be very dry. However, she smelled a damp smell. The smell of the withered leaves seemed to be mixed with other smells. Ningxuama sniffed, but she couldn't smell what it was. She looked around again. Reflected in her eyes were the big trees that looked like ghost faces. It was obviously daytime, but the sun couldn't be seen here. However, the light was still very bright. Such a bright place gave people a kind of gloomy and cold air which made people feel cold. It was a very strange place. She didn't expect that there would be such an evil place under the holy white tower. She turned her head to look at Dizun. Dizun, who was always obsessed with cleanliness, was still lying there pretending to be unconscious. What kind of trick was he playing? Such a question flashed through Ningxuama's mind. She had a very strange feeling about Dizun. He had saved her time and time again. Obviously, she could rely on him, but subconsciously, she was always on guard against him. Even Shuama herself didn't know what was going on with this kind of mentality. Furthermore, she had been preoccupied with practicing martial arts recently, so she was too lazy to analyze these trivial matters. Therefore, after deducing that the Almighty couldn't have fainted from falling off a cliff, she assumed that his current actions were intentional. As for why the ancestor had pretended to faint, she couldn't figure it out at the moment. Anyway, don't try to guess the Almighty's thoughts. You won't understand no matter how hard you try. Because of this, Ningxuama simply stopped caring about him. The Almighty was lying there pretending to be unconscious. Seeing that she wasn't fooled, he would probably get up soon. She didn't need to worry too much. Ancestor, you can rest here. I'll go ahead and explore the path. She didn't care if he could hear her or not. After saying this, she turned around and went ahead to explore the path. There was no path in the dense forest. There were only dense weeds under their feet. Occasionally, there would be long snakes, centipedes, and other creatures crawling under their feet. These trees looked a little strange, but there didn't seem to be any danger in this dense forest. Ningxuama breathed a sigh of relief. This was the ancestors' territory, so how could there be anything evil here? She walked forward for a while, but the surrounding scenery was still the same. There was no change. Ningxuama looked back again. Standing at her position, she couldn't see the ancestor's shadow. He didn't chase after her. Was he meditating in the same place? Chapter 739. Owa. A long wolf howl came from the depths of the forest. Ningxuama's footsteps paused. There were wolves. It seemed like there were still ferocious beasts in this forest. With her current ability, she naturally wasn't afraid of wolves. Even if there were 8 or 10 of them, they wouldn't be able to do anything to her. However, since there were wolves, there would be other ferocious beasts. Just in case, she had to bring some weapons or hidden weapons with her. She looked at the iron-gray branches. These branches looked very hard. It shouldn't be a problem for her to make a stick to defend herself. Shuama had always been cautious. She first used the silver hairpin on her head to scratch the tree trunk. She wanted to see if there was any poison before climbing the tree. However, after the silver hairpin scratched the tree trunk, her heart slightly jumped. With her current strength, even if it was refined iron, this hairpin would still be able to make a scratch on it. However, after she scratched the tree, she didn't even leave a mark. Isn't this tree too hard? She tried scratching it a few more times, but it was still useless. After she scratched it a few times, she felt that the ghost faces on the tree trunk were mocking her. The corners of their ugly lips curled up, her heart trembled. Was she seeing things? She turned to look at the other trees and compared them with the one she scratched. She suddenly took a step back. The ghost faces on this tree were indeed different from the other trees. The ghost faces on the other trees drooped their lips and drooped their eyes. They looked like they were crying. Only this tree was smiling. Even though she was brave, she still felt the hair on her body stand up. She took another step back and her back hit another tree. Then, as if she was burned, she jumped forward a step. The force she used to hit the tree was very small, but her back felt like it was stung by a wasp. It was painful and numb. The small piece of muscle she hit was actually hard and numb. This tree was poisonous, and it was a kind of poison she had never seen before. Oh. Not far away, there were several wolf howls, as if some wolves had found prey and were calling for their companions. Ning Xuema's expression changed slightly. She suddenly jumped and ran in the direction of the wolf howls. Di Zun was in that direction. He was still lying there. When he fell, he used his body to protect himself. It was his body that broke the branches of the ghost face tree. This tree was so hard it was as hard as iron. He was lucky that he didn't get skewered. There was an 80 to 90% chance that he was really injured and had fainted. He had left him there. If he was bitten by the wolves here. Fortunately, Ning Xuema's sense of direction was exceptionally good. Like a gust of wind, she directly rushed back. From afar, she could see pairs of oily green eyes flashing in the dense forest wolf pack. Wolves were not scary. With Ning Xuema's kung fu, it was not a problem for her to deal with 8 or 10 wolves. But what if 180 of them appeared in one go? Or perhaps it was far more than this number. Those green wolf eyes appeared in all directions, densely packed. There were no less than 300 to 400 of them. Moreover, the direction in which the wolves were surrounding was where the ancestor was lying. They probably thought that the ancestor was a delicious prey. If Ning Xuema saw such a large number of wolves on a normal day, she would have decided to run away before the wolves saw her. But now she was running even faster in that direction. She had to drag him out before those Wolf Dynasty venerable emperors bit him. If a dignified venerable emperor was bitten by a wolf, it would be the biggest joke in the world. One of them was especially tall and sturdy like an ox. It even had a horn as sharp as a blade on its head. This was obviously the alpha wolf. These wolves were crazily biting the protective white light around the ancestor's body, causing the white light to tremble incessantly. As for the alpha wolf, it used the sharp horn on its head to stab the white light. Every time it stabbed, the white light would emit a kind of popping sound, as if it would break immediately. Fortunately, the ancestor's body had a protective spiritual energy. Otherwise, when she came back, she was afraid that she would only be able to pick up a few pieces of his bones. Ning Xuema rushed over. The wolves surrounding the ancestor were obviously not easy to deal with like the other wolves. When they attacked, their bodies were like lightning. Their sharp teeth and claws flashed with cold light. Ning Xuema threw 7 or 8 stones in succession, but they were all neatly dodged by them. Chapter 741. Xuema would have been injured by their sharp teeth and claws if she didn't have a special skill. Moreover, these wolves seemed to have been trained. They even knew how to form a formation. 8 wolves attacked Ning Xuema from 8 different directions. They rose and fell one after another, advancing and retreating in a measured manner. They covered each other and attacked each other in a crisscross pattern. Like a violent storm, they attacked Ning Xuema, not giving her any chance to catch her breath. The claws and teeth of these wolves were obviously poisonous. Sometimes they didn't hit Ning Xuema, but hit the stones next to her. Anything that was hit by them would emit a wisp of green smoke. There was a fishy smell in the green smoke which made people want to vomit. If Ning Xuema didn't deal with poisons all year round, she would have been dizzy just by smelling this smell. Fortunately, her skills were much better than before. She also knew how to form a formation. After several attacks by the wolves, she mastered their attack frequency and used her flexible skills to avoid them. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to resist such a dense attack. These 8 wolves should be the guards of the alpha wolf. They trapped Ning Xuema in a place and didn't let her get close to Di Zun. As for the head wolf, it continued to gnaw at the white light barrier around Meng Cid. It was also going all out. It bit, stabbed, scratched. It even used the earth element. Occasionally, with a slap of its claws, many sharp stones would drill out from the ground and fiercely stab Di-Zun. Fortunately, Di-Zun had a protective barrier under him. Otherwise, his ass would have been pierced. The white barrier around Di-Zun's body became lighter and thinner under the continuous attack of the alpha wolf. It seemed that he couldn't hold on for more than a quarter of an hour. Ning Xuema, who was busy, naturally saw all this. She was very anxious. However, the 8 wolves besieging her were not only fast, but they also didn't seem to have any weak points. Ning Xuema didn't know how many stones she had flicked at them. Some of them even hit their eyes, but their eyelids were like steel shields. As long as they slightly closed their eyes, they would be able to block the stones Ning Xuema flicked at them. How was this a wolf made of flesh and blood? This was simply an iron wolf. How was she going to kill them? There were several times when Ning Xuema wanted to bypass these wolves and rush to the ancestor's side. They were all forced back by the wolves' sharp claws and fangs. Later, when she saw the alpha wolf use its earth magic, she had an idea. Wood counters earth. Would it be better if she used some wood chips or branches to attack? However, those trees were poisonous, so she couldn't climb them. The ground was surrounded by weeds, and there wasn't even a decent thorn. She couldn't find any wooden weapons during the fight. She looked around and suddenly saw a few scattered branches not far away. His heart skipped a beat. Those branches should have been broken when the ancestor carried her down and smashed into the trees. She didn't notice it back then, but now it had become her only hope to defeat the pack of wolves. She immediately tried to draw near to the scattered branches. The purpose of the pack of wolves was to prevent her from getting close to the ancestor. They didn't care much about her moving in other directions. Because the place where the branches were scattered was in the opposite direction to the ancestor's position, the wolves couldn't wait for her to get as far away from the ancestor as possible. When they saw her moving in that direction, they went easy on her. Therefore, Ning Xuema moved in that direction more easily. As she moved closer, she tore a piece of cloth to wrap her hand. Chapter 742. After all, the wolves were not as intelligent as humans, so they didn't understand what Ning Xuema's actions meant. Xuema was more slippery than a fish. Although she couldn't hurt the wolves, they couldn't even touch a corner of her clothes, so they couldn't hurt her at all. These wolves also had some brains and knew that Ning Xuema was a tough nut to crack. Therefore, their only thought was to delay her, and not let her get close to Di-Zun. What they really coveted was Di-Zun's flesh and blood. Therefore, the further Ning Xuema was away from Di-Zun, the more relaxed their attacks were, and the easier it was for Ning Xuema. Finally, she got close to the pile of scattered branches. Only now did she see the shape of the branches clearly. There were also small demon faces on the branches. There was no fresh wood at the broken part, but it looked like a steel bar that had been forcibly broken. The edges were as sharp as a knife. When Di-Zun fell down with her in his arms, he was stabbed by the broken part. His back was probably full of scars. However, because he was lying on his back, Ning Xuema didn't see the wounds. Also, because he was usually too strong, Xuema didn't check, which led to this accident and misunderstanding. She had almost killed him. Ning Xuema finally grabbed a broken branch that she had already set her eyes on. This branch was as thick as a forearm and as heavy as an iron rod. When she waved it, it created a whistling sound. Because Ning Xuema's hands were already wrapped in a thick cloth, the poison on the branch's skin didn't spread to her hands. It was a super handy weapon. With this weapon in hand, Ning Xuema was like a tiger that had grown wings. She immediately took the initiative and attacked the pack of wolves that had been biting her like a storm. She guessed correctly. These wolves were indeed afraid of wood attribute attacks. The thick branch in Ning Xuema's hand was indeed their nemesis. Adding on the fact that the tip of the branch was as sharp as a knife, it didn't take long for her to stab 2 of the wolf guards. After being pierced by Ning Xuema's branches, the wolf's skin, which was impenetrable by swords and spears, would have a bloody wound. The trunk of the ghost-face tree was poisonous. The poison entered the wolf's body through the wounds, making the wolf feel as if thousands of steel needles were piercing its body. The injured wolf could no longer attack Ning Xuema, could only crazily jump and howl. Its voice was so shrill that it seemed to pierce through people's eardrums. Of the 8 wolves, 2 were injured, so naturally they could no longer form a formation to attack. Ning Xuema was also not in the mood to continue fighting. Brandishing the ghost-faced tree branch, he charged in the direction of the ancestor once again. The other wolves naturally came to stop her, but at this moment Ning Shuama was like a little tiger coming down the mountain. She was unstoppable. Except for a few wolf corpses that were sent flying by her, nothing else could stop her. The alpha wolf was about to break through the protective enchantment of the delicious meat. Suddenly it saw Ning Shuama rushing over like a female demon and was shocked. Ning Shuama swept the branch in her hand toward the alpha wolf's head. The alpha wolf did not dare to face the sharp edge of the branch directly, and could only dodge and retreat. After all, the alpha wolf was the most intelligent. When it saw that things were not going well, although it was unwilling, it would not fight recklessly with Ning Shuama. It immediately retreated into the wolf pack, and urged the other wolves to attack Ning Shuama again. It wanted to tire her out by taking turns to tire her out. This time there were 300 to 400 wolves. Ning Shuama had only killed 30 to 40 wolves. The main force of the wolf pack was still there. Wolves were the animals with the strongest endurance. The wolves in this forest were even more outstanding, so they were not in a hurry. Chapter 743. Ning Shuama finally arrived in front of Di Zun. But she was alone after all. Under the continuous attacks of the wolves, she couldn't take Di Zun away. She could only protect him behind her and fight with the attacking wolves. While she was busy, she also looked at Di Zun's face in the white light. His eyes were closed as if he was meditating, and even his breathing was very weak. She could barely see the rise and fall of his chest. Di Zun was still wearing the mask, so Ning Shuama couldn't see his face clearly. So she was a little uncertain. She could only call out to him, Di Zun, Di Zun. Di Zun, wake up, wake up. Of course her call had no effect on him. Master. Master? Ning Shuama was fighting with the wolves when Kiran's call suddenly appeared in her mind. Ning Shuama was a little surprised, and then she was overjoyed. Recently Kiran had been unreliable. Every time she was in danger it wasn't by her side, so when Ning Shuama was in danger she forgot about it. At this moment when she heard its call she was overjoyed. She didn't want to talk nonsense with Kiran, so she directly told Kiran where she was and asked it to hurry over. Kiran was the king of all beasts. As long as it came it could scare away the wolves. Fortunately Kiran was also on Buddha Lotus Mountain. Fortunately, there should be no enchantment on Tianyin Peak now, so Kiran should be able to enter and come to this place smoothly. Kiran had caused a lot of trouble recently, so Di Zun asked it to stay in a place to reflect and not to disturb its master for a few days. It had been very obedient these days, cultivating and practicing martial arts obediently, even more obedient than a house cat. It had not been separated from Ning Shuama for a long time, so it didn't know how she was recovering. It was actually very worried about her. Today he had tried to contact his master. It planned to just say a few words to its master. Di Zun wouldn't know and wouldn't punish it, however. It didn't expect to know that Ning Shuama was besieged by a pack of wolves. It immediately jumped up. Its chance to perform a meritorious deed had finally come. It wanted to punish those wolves who didn't know what was good for them. They actually dared to besiege its master, the king of all beasts. They were really tired of living. It followed Ning Shuama's direction and ran through the bamboo forest, and saw the White Tower. Kiran had practiced the cloud riding. After it heard that Ning Shuama fell from the White Tower, in order to land quickly and accurately beside Ning Shuama, it had to give its all. According to Shuama's words, it's only needed to jump from the top of the mountain. It was afraid that it would make another mistake, so it jumped with all its might towards the White Pagoda. It wanted to jump on top of the tower first and then before jumping down. However, it didn't expect that when its claws touched the White Tower, it immediately felt that something was wrong. But as for the ancestor, Ning Shuama always felt that the ancestor would never fall. He was omnipotent. The ancestor glanced at her, a faint light flickering in his eyes. You want to abandon this king again? Ning Shuama was stunned. She remembered what she had done just now. It seemed that she had indeed abandoned him, however. She did not think that he was really injured and thought that he was faking it. Hey, he was obviously unconscious just now. How did he know that she had abandoned him? This king didn't faint. I just couldn't move at that time. The ancestor's words cleared her doubts. His thin lips behind the mask slightly pursed. I'm sorry. Ning Xuema was actually very guilty. Because of her mistaken judgment, the ancestor had almost died in the mouth of the wolves. Ning Xuema knew this very well. Besides, she wasn't interested anyway. Now was a good time to leave. Her wishful thinking was ruthlessly broken by the ancestor. You must come with me. Why? Ning Xuema widened her eyes. My injury. Don't tell me you don't want to take care of me again? The ancestor's black eyes seemed to be a little hurt. Hearing his words, Ning Xuema felt a bit guilty and paused for a moment. But didn't you say that only you can enter this place? Before she finished speaking, her waist was suddenly tightened. She was unexpectedly picked up by the ancestor. I'll carry you there. The ancestor turned his head and said to Kirin, you can wait here, or you can go to the dark forest to gain experience. Chapter 751. Remember, the beasts here fight based on their real abilities. They are not bound by any rules in this world. If you can't beat them, just come to the Buddha Lotus Lake. Kirin was very pleased with the Dizun's words. Kirin's eyes lit up. What it lacked now was training itself. Usually, the beasts would run away when they saw it, so it couldn't even find an opponent to fight with. But here it didn't have to worry about that at all. There were many stupid wolves here, so they weren't afraid of it, the king of all beasts. It could fight to its heart's content here. It also wanted to become stronger. It didn't want to scare away other beasts with its identity. The little Qilin turned around and ran back the way it came, rushing straight into the dark forest. Wolves, I'm back. Ning Xuema was speechless. She was caught off guard and fell into his arms. At this moment she couldn't help but struggle. Wasn't he so weak that he couldn't stand? How could he still have the strength to hug her? Was he pretending to be weak just now? Ning Xuema was angry that she had been fooled. Her struggle made his body sway again. It seemed that he couldn't stand still and fell on the Buddha Lotus Lake. Half of his body was submerged in the water. When he fell down, he was probably afraid of drowning her. Even though he was clearly in a forward position, he abruptly twisted his body backwards. Ning Xuema directly laid in his embrace. Not a single drop of water came into contact with her. Ning Xuema was speechless. Under the mask, his lips were shockingly pale. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. She quickly jumped to the side and helped him up. Are you okay? The ancestor was drenched in water. Even the tips of his hair were dripping with water. The water droplets flowed down his white jade mask and dripped into his tightly buttoned lapel. There was a kind of soul-stirring beauty about him. Ning Xuema couldn't quite wrap her head around the fact that someone who had always been incomparably strong had become so weak. After he stood up, he was a little shaky. Ning Xuema was shocked, especially the injury on his back. It seemed that the fall just now had made it worse. Drops of blood were flowing out one by one. Ning Xuema could not help but support him from the side, allowing half of his body to lean on her. There was a strange fragrance on the ancestor's body. It smelled like herbs and flowers. She had noticed it when she was running for her life, but now that she had calmed down, the fragrance was even more obvious. Smelling this aroma, her emotions were strangely stirred, as if some kind of appetite had been aroused. She had the urge to bite him. Xuema herself was shocked by this sudden impulse. She pursed her lips and held her breath. Why did he have such a strange impulse? You haven't eaten. Are you hungry? She suddenly thought of a more reliable idea. Dizun, I can treat the wounds on your back. Chapter 752. The scene looked beautiful, but Ning Xuema was very nervous at the moment. How could she be in the mood to enjoy the scenery? She looked at the Dizun's face from time to time, fearing that he would pass out. Although the Dizun was very weak, he was swaying with every step. Ning Xuema's heart was also swaying. Fortunately, he was holding her firmly and didn't have the slightest intention to throw her away. Ning Xuema's body was stiff. In fact, she was ready to jump to the ground and hug him if he couldn't hold her. However, the Dizun didn't give her this opportunity. He carried Xuema and walked for about 100 steps on the jellyfish road. In front of them appeared an oversized jellyfish. No, it was an oversized jellyfish-like house. The house looked transparent from afar, like a crystal, but they couldn't see anything inside. It was as beautiful as a fairy tale castle. Ning Xuema didn't expect to see such a house in such a place. When she saw it, she was a little stunned. The style of this castle didn't look like the work of the Dizun. So fairy tale, so dreamy. Could it be that the Dizun's illegitimate daughter lived in it? She was shocked by her own thoughts. How could a person like the Dizun have an illegitimate daughter? He didn't even have a decent lover. There was a crystal-like platform in front of the jellyfish-like castle. The Dizun held her and walked to the platform. He shook violently and was about to fall to one side. Fortunately, Ning Xuema was prepared this time. She immediately did a somersault and jumped to the ground. Then, like lightning, she used her shoulder to support the ancestor's falling body. Humph! She knew it would be like this. When people were seriously injured, they usually relied on their last breath to do anything. Once they reached the destination, they would definitely fall down. It worked every time. The Dizun was so weak that he couldn't be supported. Ning Xuema used half of her body to support him, but he still wanted to slip down. Ning Xuema had no choice but to bend down and carry him up. The ancestor was tall and big. Now that he was being carried like a princess, his long arms and legs almost drooped to the ground. "Ancestor, are you all right?" Ning Xuema carried him up the steps and arrived in front of the castle gate. The gate of the castle was sky blue and translucent, with a faint pearl light flowing on it. It was so beautiful that it was like a dream. Ning Xuema was shocked. The jellyfish-like castle and the shell-like door gave her a familiar yet strange feeling. Perhaps she had seen such a dreamy place in her childhood dreams? "Go in." The ancestor spat out these two words softly, his lips turning even paler. At this time, Ning Xuema didn't have time to study the unbelievably beautiful door. She kicked the door open and carried him in. The sky was like a dome, enveloping the surroundings. Ning Xuema knew that the layout of the castle should be very dreamy, but she didn't expect it to be this dreamy. The ceiling was transparent like glass and was semicircular. When he looked up, he could see the deep blue sky outside. In the dark forest, the sky was always covered by clouds and fog, but here he could see the real sky clearly. The sky was dark blue and there were a few white clouds floating. The reflection of the white clouds even reflected on the dark blue floor. They floated slowly, as if the sky and the world were one. Walking in the castle made people feel as if they were walking in the sky, free and unfettered among the white clouds. There was only one hall in the castle, which looked like a dreamy sky. The most conspicuous thing in the hall was a big bed. Chapter 753. The bed was shaped like an oversized cloud. It didn't have the bed curtains that were commonly seen in this era. From afar it looked like a cloud. In the middle of the hall there was a luminous pearl the size of a small moon, faintly emitting light. Half of the luminous pearl was shining and the other half was not. From afar it really looked like a round jade plate. There were other decorations around, and those decorations also looked like clouds of various sizes. They stood there quietly, as if they had been there for thousands of years. When Ning Xuema walked into the castle with the Dizun in her arms, she felt as if she had walked into the vast sky. Surrounding them were floating white clouds, and there was also a round crescent moon shining brightly. The crescent moon, the small boat has two sharp enzymes sitting on the crescent boat, holding the moon and playing on the swing. This was a children's song that Ning Xuema had read when she was a child. She had always thought that it was the most fairy tale fantasy in the poet's heart. She had never thought that she would see such a real thing here. It made her almost suspect that she was in a dream. Her heart felt warm, and there was also an indescribable feeling of sourness. "Go to the bed." The Dizun in her arms said 3 words. Why does this sentence sound so ambiguous? Ning Shuama couldn't help but feel speechless while holding the D-Zun. She didn't have time to think about it. She walked over and put him on the cloud bed. The bed looked like a soft cloud, but the bed was still very hard. There was no bedding on it, only a white bedboard. After putting the D-Zun down, Ning Shuama couldn't help but touch the bed. It was cold to the touch, like ice. It turned out that the bed that looked so warm was actually so cold. Could it be the legendary frost jade bed? There was a faint white air lingering on the bed. The D-Zun was sitting on the bed like a god sitting upright in the clouds. Ning Shuama was in a daze for a moment. Didn't you want to treat the injury on my back? The D-Zun called her back from her daze. Ah yes, Ning Shuama finally remembered her mission. After thinking for a while, she also jumped on the bed. She shivered as soon as she got on. It was really cold. This bed was really cold. As soon as her feet stepped on the ground, she felt a sharp chill shoot up from the soles of her feet, instantly spreading throughout her body, making her feel as if the blood in her body was almost frozen. Her rosy little face instantly turned pale. Get down! The ancestor spat out 2 words. His voice was as calm as flowing water, but it was unquestionable. Ning Shuama. He didn't allow anyone else to sleep on his bed? TSK, did he think she was willing to be on top? Without another word, she jumped off the bed. When her feet touched the floor again, the bone-piercing cold finally disappeared. There was an iron-gray luster around the broken branches, and blood was seeping out. These 3 wounds on such a perfect back were simply like 3 annoying flaws on a piece of top-grade jade, making people want to use violence to erase those flaws and restore it to its original state. Ning Shuama's eyes stared fixedly at the 3 wounds. For a moment, she did not make any movements. Although D-Zun's back was facing her, he could feel her gaze on his back. His thin lips slightly raised. Rongyi Yuishinlin said that women also liked beauty. When necessary, the temptation of beauty could be a good way to win the heart of a beauty. In fact, D-Zun did not agree with Rongyi Yuishinlin's words. Now it seemed that Rongyi Yuishinlin was right. Women were also easily fascinated by beauty. That perfect line impacted the senses of a person's vision, making Ning Shuama, who had undergone special training, feel her heart madly beat a few times. A person's beauty wasn't considered too heaven-defying. What was heaven-defying was that from the tip of his hair to the soles of his feet, there wasn't a single spot that wasn't perfect. It was as if she had gathered the essence of all the beauty in the world. Ning Shuama couldn't help but sigh in her heart. The God who created him must be his own father. She loved him so much that it was in her bones. She almost suspected that if this person's flesh and blood were removed, his skeleton would also be shockingly beautiful. No wonder he didn't care about all the beauties in the world. Chapter 760. A thought suddenly floated into Shuama's mind. Could it be that the bright purple blood was the color of the ancestor's heart? That's impossible, right? Shouldn't the color of blood be the same? How could only the blood of the heart be special? As she pondered, she quickly tended to his wound. She had done everything she could. Now she just had to wait for him to wake up and see if he had any medicine on him. Ning Shuama tidied up the miscellaneous items, cleaned the 2 knives and put them aside. She then looked at the ancestor. The ancestor was lying on his side with his eyes slightly closed. There was a faint white mist surrounding his body on the cloud bed, as if it was revolving around him and healing his wounds. That cloud bed seemed to be his personal item. Ning Shuama still couldn't touch it. When she touched it with her hand, she felt that it was cold to the bone. He was lying on it, but he didn't seem to be cold at all. Ning Shuama sat next to him and observed for a while. Seeing that he didn't move and his complexion didn't change, she felt relieved. It was only at this moment that she was in the mood to walk around this fairy tale-like castle. At first glance it looked like there was only one hall in this place, but after careful observation, Ning Xuema found two small doors. These two small doors blended in with the surrounding light blue walls. She couldn't even see a crack. If she didn't know about mechanisms, she wouldn't have been able to find them. Of these two small halls, one was a storage room. The two knives were found here. The other room was completely empty. Only the ancestor could come to this place. It should be a place where he cultivated, right? She didn't expect that such a cold person would have such a fairy tale-like house. Could it be that such a lofty person also subconsciously longed for childlike fun? She walked around the hall again and sat down on a chair that looked like a white cloud. She looked up at the ceiling of the hall and watched the clouds pass by. She couldn't help but sigh. This place was really romantic. If you brought your loved one here for a vacation, you could see the blue sky and white clouds during the day and the vast galaxy at night. That would really be the life of an immortal. She couldn't help but look at the big bed again. It was such a big bed. If only she could lie down on it. Lying on the cloud bed and looking at the scenery above would be even more beautiful. If she could lie down on it with her lover, nesting in her lover's arms, it would be even better. What a pity. She couldn't go up. She touched her nose and looked at the D-zone above her. Forget it. Even if she could go up, she couldn't lie down with the ancestor. She was also a little tired, but in order to take care of the seriously injured D-zone, she didn't dare to rest. She stayed in the hall and looked at the scenery in the sky for a while, then came out to see if Kiran had returned. Could it be this possibility? Is that so? Is that so? Is that so? What if it is? If that was the case, what should she do? How should he respond to him? Being liked by such a great god was both a good thing and a bad thing. If she also loved him very much now and both of them were in love with each other, she could just accept it and fly away together. But now, even she couldn't tell if she liked him or not. She seemed to like him very much, but she also felt an inexplicable repulsion. She wanted to reject, but would the great deity allow her to do so? She hugged her knees as she sat on the futon. For a moment she was lost in thought. After thinking for a while, she raised her hand and knocked on her head. Chapter 764. But now his clothes were half off and he was lying there, allowing her to do whatever she wanted. His face was usually pale, and there was almost no expression on his face. When he looked down at people, there was a sense of condescension, making people not dare to get close to him. But now he was lying in front of her. His cheeks were light pink because of the high temperature, and his long eyelashes covered his eyelids. Occasionally, his thin lips would open slightly, spitting out one or two vague notes. This posture, it was like a god in distress who had been pulled down from his throne and mistakenly entered the mortal world. It made Ning Xuema have an unprecedented strange feeling in her heart. She actually had an impulse to hug him. This feeling came so suddenly that it shocked her. She shook her head to shake off the messy thoughts in her mind and focused on wiping his body. When she was wiping his palms, he suddenly turned his hand and grabbed her wrist. He suddenly pulled her. Ning Xuema was naturally unprepared at this time, and he was strangely strong. She was actually pulled onto the bed by him. She fell into his arms. A familiar smell came to her face and enveloped her whole body. Ning Xuema cried out in a low voice. She subconsciously wanted to push him away, but her wrist was caught by him. Even if this person was unconscious, his technique was extremely accurate. He was holding her wrist. When her wrist was held, she could not use her strength. She pushed him, but he did not push her away. Instead, he hugged her even tighter. Ning Xuema was a little angry. She immediately wanted to kick him away, but his vague murmurs made her freeze. Momo, there was pain, helplessness, and even a trace of sadness in his voice. Ning Xuema felt as if she was struck by lightning. Her heart felt as if it was being ruthlessly grasped by someone. It made her nose ache inexplicably. In this way he was not as aloof as he usually was. He was inexplicably fragile like glass. He would never appear like this when he was awake, but it really touched Ning Shuima's heart. She could not bear to push him away again ever since she had known him. He had called her Shuima, called her little miss, little girl, and even called her by her full name. However, this was the first time he had called her Momo. His voice was filled with tenderness, pleading, and gentleness. Perhaps he felt Shuima loosen her grip, so he hugged her even tighter, as if he wanted to squeeze her into his bones. It was so tight that she could hardly breathe. Because of his high fever, his embrace was hot. Ning Shuima had the illusion that she was going to melt in his embrace. His lips were right beside her ear, almost sucking on her earlobe and igniting her soul. Don't be so ruthless. His hot breath made Shuima's body hot and cold. She could barely hear what he was saying. She only heard two words clearly. Momo, Momo. Was he calling her? Or was he calling a girl with the same name as her? The last guess made her feel a little uncomfortable. She was about to try to push him away again. However, he murmured again, Shuima. Just this one sentence made Ning Shuima feel as if her acupoints had been pressed. Her heart rose and fell like a tide. Shuima. Don't be afraid of me, Shuima. He murmured a few intermittent words. His eyebrows were slightly furrowed, and his thin lips were dry. He looked like a lost child. Chapter 765. Ning Shuima's heart felt as if it was being slowly squeezed by someone. Following his whispers, the squeezing became tighter and tighter. That pain was mixed with a kind of grievance and heartache, causing her eyes to redden. She shrank into his chest, her hands and feet aching. She couldn't struggle, or perhaps she didn't want to struggle. She simply allowed him to hold her tighter and tighter. Momo. He sighed and whispered, you clearly like me, you clearly, why do you do this? It was like he was in a nightmare. The pain in his voice became even heavier, as if he were confused, as if he didn't understand, as if he was filled with grief that couldn't be dissolved. Ning Shuima's body stiffened again. Being held in his fiery embrace, the high heat caused her mind to become a bit muddled. She could only faintly feel that something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. His lips suddenly fell, directly kissing Ning Shuima's lips. His lips were dry, and it hurt a bit as they rubbed against hers. But when that fiery breath rushed into her mouth, she was stunned. Her heart seemed as if it would jump out of her chest. This was the second time he had kissed her. The first time was on Carefree Island. His deep kiss had contained a probing meaning. At that time she still had the appearance of an old lady. This time she had finally restored her original appearance, but he had been in a semi-conscious state. His kiss was fiery and domineering, as if he wanted to sweep away everything in Shuima's mouth. He wanted to sweep away her soul and fuse it into his flesh and blood, so that they could never be separated from each other again. That kiss was like the end of the world. That kiss caused Ning Shuima to become dizzy. She was no longer able to resist him, nor was she able to think clearly. She didn't know when her arms had wrapped around his waist, but she could feel his warmth, feel his everything. His clothes were already half off. Ning Shuima was lying in his embrace, and she could clearly feel the fiery heat in his chest. That heat seemed to pass through her clothes and into her heart. Her heart was filled with both sweetness and sourness. Even she couldn't describe this feeling. She could feel that his body was getting hotter and hotter, and she could feel that something was pushing against her lower abdomen, causing her to feel pain. She felt his hands tugging at her clothes. She felt that he was no longer satisfied with just kissing her lips. His kisses gradually moved downwards, kissing her chin, neck, collarbone, shoulder. Inch by inch, inch by inch, inch by inch, lost in ecstasy. Inch by inch, Ning Shuima was almost lost in the passion he gave her. She couldn't find her reason anymore. She just hugged him and felt him, scared out of her wits. She had even forgotten who she was.